Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now what started life as a cheap office PC soon turned into one of the sketchiest £230, $300 or €275 gaming PCs I've ever put together. After removing and selling the parts I didn't need or wanted to change and getting a total of £20, this machine owed me just £5. I was pretty keen to stick to a strict £230 budget, as the total cost would equal $300. That way it was more challenging and fun for me to try and build something that would run more than Microsoft Paint. The first component I replaced was the power supply. I got this EVGA 600 watt unit from a local marketplace seller for just £10 because apparently it had been sitting in a garage for months gathering cobwebs and soaking up moisture. Sounds familiar. It spent the last few days sitting by the hottest radiator in the house to dry, so hopefully it won't roast the rest of the system like a soft white marshmallow when I finally build up the courage to turn it on. Externally, it's in excellent condition. I replaced the Celeron G1610 with a processor that should be able to render the entirety of GTA 5 and not just half of it. The i7-2600 is one of the best CPUs that the motherboard supports. This was from CEX and cost £36 with a 24-month warranty. We already had the Akasa cooler, which would keep the i7 temps down just fine. The graphics card was from the same place. I paid over the odds by about £20 according to what I could find on eBay, but this Gigabyte Windforce GTX 1060 OC is one of the better models, and like the i7 it comes with a warranty, which is always a bonus for used parts. It fits in the case just fine, but the fans are awfully close to the cables, and trying to close the side panel with the 6-pin power connector positioned like that, forget about it. This brought our total expenditure so far up to £221, roughly $288 or €264. The additional stick of RAM cost another tenner, and while I might have stuck with 8 gigs should it have been in dual channel, it wasn't, so I saw no reason not to upgrade this thing to 16. The Spectec 1333MHz RAM I used was found at a local PC recycler, and I was informed that it's plentiful in pre-builts and therefore cheap. At £231, $300 or €276, we have a PC that might start, could potentially fry everything inside it, and due to the layout of the SATA connectors, might jam up the GPU fans when they're spinning under a higher load. We've still got a hard drive in here too, but I'd advise either selling this and putting the money towards an SSD, or just buying the cheapest SSD you can for a boot drive. That said, this system, and therefore this hard drive, did come with Windows 10 installed, so we've still got that. It's legit and activated too, which saves us some money. Also, we need a rear fan. I mean, the side panel doesn't really fit, not comfortably, so the system won't get too hot, but some spare change spent on a second-hand exhaust fan wouldn't hurt. Up until yesterday, I had a DVD drive in here as well, as you may have seen on my photo on Twitter, at RGInHD, but I sold it this morning because I'd never use it, and it meant I could stick to my budget. It also gave us more room to hide the PSU cables. Right, let's turn this thing on and get the fire blankets at the ready. I'll call the neighbours first in case they have to evacuate in a hurry. I was certain that hitting the power button would generate more pops and bangs than a 17-year-old's Vauxhall Corsa in the McDonald's car park on a Friday night, but lo and behold, everything was up and running. Not the speediest system thanks to the HDD, but it's nothing a future and relatively low-cost upgrade to an SSD couldn't fix. Gaming time. I can't pretend that older 4-core CPUs like the i7 here won't struggle these days. Despite hyper-threading, Cyberpunk 2077, a particularly CPU-intensive game, especially in busier areas like the heart of Night City, will have some issues. We'll be testing the GTX 1060 with a more powerful processor on a separate occasion to see what it can still do, but even with this aging quad-core and decent settings, performance is okay. It's definitely playable. This is a sort of worst case example of the trouble you may run into in 2022 with specs like these. Far Cry 6 runs nicely. I've pushed the system a little bit as well by avoiding low settings and things like dynamic res and FSR. If you have an i7 second or third gen system, you might be able to make the most out of it with a weaker, less expensive graphics card, maybe a GTX 970 or something like that. But a 1060 isn't what I'd call overkill by any means, especially not in games that are more GPU intensive. GTA 5 as expected runs really well with rare dips below 60 FPS downtown and in other busier areas. To combat this you could turn some of the in-game sliders down, but with the high settings the game was more than playable. I definitely think that 16 gigs of RAM is ideal as a minimum in 2022. If you're on a very tight budget then 8 will suffice, but I'd recommend aiming for 16 just to be sure. As you can see with the selected settings, even GTA is using more than 8 gigs. God of War is a game I've recently reinstalled. I played it for a while at launch and then I uninstalled it for the sake of space. Speaking of which, a 500 gig hard drive or SSD might get filled up pretty quickly these days, but if you do have less to spend, I'd suggest buying a lower cost, smaller SSD as a boot drive and a large hard drive for storage. With hard drives, you do of course get a lot more storage for the money. Back on subject, and God of War runs really well with the original preset. Even with this intensive boss battle on screen, the frame rate is holding up fairly well. Forza Horizon 5 with the high preset and MSAA off runs with over 60 FPS on average. FXAA was enabled too. There are some dips below 60 which, like with all of today's tested games, can be blamed on the aging processor, though it's holding up respectably overall. I've heard people mention that this is best installed on an SSD because there are texture issues when driving really fast on an HDD. I haven't experienced that myself today, but overall Forza is certainly playable, competitively so too. As you can see, my dodgy PSU hasn't blown up either, which is always a nice bonus. Please excuse the judderiness of Fortnite. There's still internet work being carried out down my road and it makes things look pretty bad here. That's not to say there wasn't some stutter anyway, and it didn't stop me from wiping out numerous enemies, but if you haven't got an internet connection that's worse than Fred Flintstone's, then things will run a lot better with this combination. It's typical that when I want to record a video, the builders decide that it's the only time of the day that they want to do some work next door. It's always the way. So I apologise for any noise, but it shouldn't last long. They tend to work for about 3 minutes, have a cup of tea and then sit around doing nothing till they go home. Warzone also performed okay, but suffered in the same way as Fortnite because of my current internet issues. You can see the footage sort of jumping around due to the man up the telegraph pole outside my window playing around with some cables. Seriously though, this combo can handle Warzone just fine. It's not a faultless experience, but it is playable. Overall, the cheap ZooStorm Office PC has had some new life breathed into it. This was sort of a roundabout way of building a gaming rig, selling off components first, then buying others, but it is one way of keeping costs down. Alternatively, you could build something from scratch if you can find parts cheap enough, or purchase a better spec pre-built to begin with, perhaps an old HP or Dell with a suitable PSU, which would allow you to drop in a new graphics card without having to make any other changes. As for this one though, well, I hope you've enjoyed it. If you did, leave a like on it down below. Leave a dislike if you didn't. I'll let you know if the PSU does eventually decide to die and whether or not it takes other components with it. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and hopefully I'll see all of you in the next one.